has been broadened and strengthened, and the body of human rights instruments renewed and enlarged by governments, non-governmental organizations, and conscientious citizens throughout the world for almost half a century, since 1948, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed by more than 100 nations. A teacher of mine who passed away 2 years ago by the name of Wu De Yao was one of the original drafters of the UN Declaration. And as original drafter, he of course worked very closely with Eleanor Roosevelt. She was the chair of the commission. And he himself, by faith, was a Christian, but also became a major scholar in Confucian studies in Singapore and in Malaysia and Taiwan. So he, through his career, tried to look for common ground, possible interaction between human rights discourse on the one hand and Confucian ethics on the other. But there's no question about the fact that from a historical and comparative cultural perspective, human rights emerged out of the modern mentality of the Enlightenment of the modern West. We are so seasoned in the Enlightenment mentality that we assume the reasonableness of its general ideological thrust, and we considered many of the values that it embodies self-evident. These values, of course, include liberty, equality, progress, the dignity of the individual, respect for privacy, government for, by, and of the people, due process of law, and human rights. So when you think about human rights, often you think about these values derived from the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment faith in progress, reason, and individualism may have lost some of its persuasive power in the West, but it remains a standard of inspiration for intellectual and spiritual leaders throughout the world. So in Beijing, in Hong Kong, Taipei, or Singapore, you'll find major defenders of these ideas. And it is inconceivable that any modern project, including ecological projects in ecological sciences, does not subscribe to the thesis that the human condition is improvable, that it is desirable to find rational means to solve world's problems, and it is desirable to find not just rational means, but also the dignity of the person as an individual ought to be respected. So we can say that human rights is linked to this idea of the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment is human awakening, the respect for the individual. It's still the most influential moral discourse in the political culture of the modern age. Of course, in this course, we also address issues of the negative consequences, often the unintended negative consequences of the Enlightenment. A kind of runaway technology of development that may have been a spectacular achievement in the initial stage as an achievement of human ingenuity. But it also led to all kinds of other problems that we face today, especially fueled by a kind of Faustian drive to not only to know, to understand, but also to subdue and to conquer. So the modern West with Enlightenment ideology is either considered as great liberation for the global community, or because of the historical problems of imperialism and colonialism, a continuous ideology of exploitation. The human rights discourse in this case is both self-evidently true, no matter where you are. It has nothing to do with the division between East and West, but at the same time, it is also an arena for major international debate and argument. So I think I would take the advice of some of the intellectuals deeply involved in the human rights discourse seriously, that first of all, the danger of a cynical approach according to which the international dimension of human rights is nothing more than an ideological cover for the realpolitik of states. One position that is very common, especially in Asia, is that human rights discourse is no more than a kind of ideological cover for the realpolitik of states. In other words, United States, some European countries want to use human rights to discipline Asian societies. There's a cynicism embedded in that particular situation. But also there is the danger of a naive approach according to which human rights would be the expression of universally shared values to which all the members of the international community would naturally aspire. So if you don't accept human rights, there's something fundamentally wrong with you. We need to, my own position, this is the time for me to just state my own position on this. I maintain the universality of human rights broadly conceived in the 1948 Declaration as a source of inspiration for the global community. And I don't mind defending the moral and legal imperative that any civilized state treat its citizens in accordance with the political rights generated by often by its own constitution. And I profess the desirability of democracy as providing to this state the most effective framework in which human rights are safeguarded. But I'm also critically aware that a human rights movement is a dynamic process rather than a static structure. And the human rights discourse ought to be dialogical, meaning conversation between two partners, communicative, and mutually beneficial. Now, there's no question about the fact that human rights discourse is rooted in a very strong version of individualism. So on the surface, very un-Confucian, because the Confucian tradition underscore a person as a central relationships, the importance of community as an irreducible dimension of being human. We also know, I simply want to mention in passing, that the human rights discourse as it evolved out of the West was a very rich and complicated history with Locke's understanding of natural rights and, of course, emphasis on private property. You don't have private property, can you have rights? The whole question was discussed by the framers of the American Constitution. Also have Adam Smith's notion about self-interest. A rational human being is defined by the person's ability to develop his or her self-interest. If you do not even understand your self-interest, and you're not even mature as a modern citizen. And of course, John Stuart Mill's very powerful, persuasive argument in defense of privacy. Privacy meaning there's an arena that I can call my own, that even the closest kin, my parents, are not supposed to invade. For example, I have privacy to my diary, and I don't allow anyone to read it. Privacy to my own private correspondence. It's a major problem in Asia, when the mothers sometimes say, if you don't have anything to hide, why you have to keep your diary? If I read it, I can help you to be a better person. Now, Peter Berger argues to me persuasively that a sense of alienation, especially alienation from the group, from society, is a necessary condition for freedom. If you don't have a sense of alienation, you don't have to appeal to Karl Marx. It's just, if you don't have sense of alienation, it's difficult for you to develop freedom. The idea of freedom in this sense is to defend against encroachments from outside, from the state from the community, even from family members. So the dignity, independence, and autonomy of the person as an individual is predicated on this very strong sense of the person as, if not an isolatable, if not an isolated, at least isolatable human being. That's the idea of the individuality. In fact, our self-reliance is based upon, in the whole legal system, if I'm not an individual, if my action is being influenced by all kinds of forces beyond my control, even when I'm in the passion of doing something totally beside myself. So you can use the psychiatric argument, insanity, as a way of excusing myself as a moral agent for doing something which turned out to be heinous crime against some other human beings. So the sense of the person as an isolatable individual in terms of self-reliance, in terms of privacy, is absolutely critical. In addition, there's also another set of reasons behind the human rights discourse, fundamentally different from the Confucian style of moral reasoning, that is linked to law. If it is not linked to law, it's not enforceable. It's just plain talk. It's moral persuasion. Moral persuasion is not good enough. You have to have the tremendous of pressure and legal constraint. Therefore, the United Nations, as an instrument, will be able to use international laws and regulations to discipline countries like the former South Africa or the Soviet Union before the disintegration, and now China. And this legal constraint is predicated on the psychology of suspicion. If you have tremendous faith in the intelligence and benevolence of the ruler, you're not going to look for the various kinds of legal constraints that will limit the dictatorial power of the ruler. So the psychology of suspicion is absolutely crucial. At the same time, there's need for the mechanism, certain specific mechanism, laid down in laws, and the laws will have to be implemented by the courts, maybe eventually enforced by the agents of the government, the police, and so forth, for anyone who moves outside of that arena. And it is also based upon what I call an adversarial system, a system of checks and balances, system of conflict. You have to have some kind of recourse to be able to express your discontent, to protect your rights. Rights ought to be protected. If they're not protected, if there are no mechanism, no legal constraint, and these are not actual rights. So rights need not be, cannot be violated without major consequences. Even rights violated by seemingly all-powerful state. And this is also this notion that a state is a necessary evil in the sense the smaller the state's power in adjudicating differences, in invading the privacy of the people, the better. And it's the market mechanism controlled by the legal framework that seems to work the best for the human rights discourse. But it is useful to note that as a dynamic process, the human rights agenda evolved gradually, even in the United States. And of course, the United States, the country blessed with a very strong tradition of civil society, in the sense of the various kinds of local organizations, civic organizations, not directly under the control of the central government, remain extremely vibrant. When the French intellectual Tocqueville visited the United States in the late 19th century, 1860s, and he was greatly impressed by the dynamism of the United States as a country in terms of civic organizations, mass participation in the political process. There are two conditions for any civil society to work well. One condition is the existence of many civic organizations independent of the direct control of the central state, federal government. The other condition is each of these organizations may have an access to the center by influencing the center, through lobbying group, through all kinds of other mechanisms. So on the one hand, the independent existence of these civic groups, and each one of them has an access to the power center. And this kind of civil society was even absent in Europe at the time, let alone in Asia. So it's a very distinctive feature of American society. So understandably, the framers of the American Constitution were profoundly serious about political rights. Rights of speech, not to be interfere with the government organizations, not to be arrested without warrant, all these political rights. They were not, I want to underscore, they were not particularly concerned about economic rights, let alone, they were not concerned about, say, cultural rights or civil rights. Why they were not concerned about economic rights? Because the framers of the constitutions themselves were the beneficiaries of the economic system. Many of them are even slave owners. They're not concerned about economic rights. They're concerned about their own, of course, their own communities' political rights. It was not until, we're talking about 18th century, not until the 19th century, because of influence of socialism, thinkers addressed the maldistribution of wealth and income, the concentration of capital, and the exploitation of labor as central issues in politics. And partly because of Marxism, but not just Marxism, people interested in social welfare and so forth. So it is in this period that some issues of economic rights, not necessarily in the Constitution, but became expressions, became important demands. The perception of justice as fairness is as much a socialist as a liberal contribution. So it's not simply a liberal contribution to discuss justice as fairness. It's also deeply ingrained in socialism. That's why for a time that we believe that in the capitalist countries, United States and European societies, liberty turned out to be one of the most powerful values. Of course, today it still is, not equality. Whereas in the socialist countries, at least at the rhetorical level, equality was considered more important than liberty. But it was in the late 1960s that the civil rights movement made substantial progress in solving the American dilemma. I think progress in solving it, of course, not solved, may not even be solvable, of racism, which to this day remains, I would say, a serious cancerous growth in the American body politic. It's a serious problem. So we should remind ourselves also that when we're dealing with the Soviet Union as an adversary, try to discipline the Soviet Union in terms of its human rights record, the whole issue of immigration rights, particularly in reference to the Jewish population in the former Soviet Union, was an important aspect of our official human rights agenda in the 1970s. So when we dealt with the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, we insisted the immigration rights of the Jewish population in the Soviet Union. That was a major issue. Many, many intellectuals, myself included, were involved in that process. Columbia boycotted any communication with the Soviet Academy of Sciences if they did not allow some of the Jewish scientists to leave, either to go to Israel or to come to the United States. So the immigration issue was the most important. Now, this very brief summary of the human rights discourse as an evolving process in the United States clearly indicates that a sophisticated understanding of human rights as an evolving enterprise in our own country requires certainly historical consciousness, how it actually evolved, geopolitical analysis, what country we're dealing with, what kind of policies we have, and of course our self-understanding. The assumption that we are the champions of human rights because through exemplary teaching we have gained the authority to do so is certainly not, is either naive or cynical. The Vienna Declaration and Program of Action resulting from the World Conference on Human Rights in June 1993, for the first time in the human rights discourse, directs our attention to women, children, minorities, disabled persons, and indigenous peoples. Imagine these were not included in the early discourse for 2 centuries of human rights discussion. And of course, the record shows that we are very much behind several industrialized societies in offering basic rights to our citizens. The 3 key regional conferences in Tunisia, in San Jose, and in Bangkok, as an integral part of the preparatory process that eventually culminated in the Vienna Conference last year, produced several human rights declarations outlining particular concerns and perspectives of the African, the Latin American, and the Caribbean, and also Asian Pacific regions. So for the first time, a conscientious effort was made to allow the human rights discourse to be broadened to include Africa, Caribbean countries, and Asia. The recognition of interdependence between democracy, development, and human rights led to the cooperation of international organizations and national agencies in broadening the concept of human rights to include even the right to development. While the confluence of social and economic concerns may have undermined, this is the concern of many human rights fighters in the United States now, Asia Watchers and so forth. The kind of confluence of social and economic concerns may have undermined the effectiveness of national and international instruments focusing on well-defined political rights. It has engendered new mechanisms for the promotion of human rights. In other words, when you talk about human rights, do you focus on political rights, or you need to also include economic rights, social rights, cultural rights? And we have now 2 radically different approaches, and they're really in conflict about human rights discourse. On the one hand, we have the conception it is universalizable. So we need to push the human rights discourse, especially political rights, all over the world. We need to single out some countries for discipline. Certainly North Korea, but China, Iraq, and a number of countries. Their records are so poor that we have to discipline them, and we need to broaden human rights discourse based upon our understanding of political rights. That's one position. The other position is that human rights discourse assume different cultural forms in different cultural contexts. You cannot impose your Western or Europe-centered idea of human rights with emphasis on political rights on societies like China, like North Korea, or even Iraq. Now, what is my position? Okay. My position, again, simply put, if human right in the minimum condition is understood as the injunction that civilized governments will have to treat their citizens according to some basic political rights. No torture, do not arrest people without warrant, allow dissidents to express themselves, the freedom of speech, some of the minimum requirements as stated in the UN Declaration of Human Rights as a minimum requirement. I think it is the responsibility of the international community as a whole to enforce these basic human rights. We did it with South Africa. when the apartheid was in force. We should continue to do it with China, with any other countries that violate the basic human rights. There's a minimum requirement and very little argument about cultural flourishing, because unless you meet the minimum requirements, any kind of cultural argument is just a cover-up. Having said that, it's important to note that human rights issue as understood in Bangkok by all Asian countries, especially those countries under the influence of Confucian culture, signed by all the governments, seems to argue against a very narrowly defined human rights agenda. In other words, human rights means nothing but political rights. And I would like to look at human rights in a much broader context, including economic, social, cultural rights, and even the right to development. And this, in fact, is the spirit of the UN Declaration of Human Rights as early as 1948. All these rights were included in the UN Declaration. But the American government, together with a number of European governments, decided to focus on the political rights, and for very good reasons, and with some very good results. But the time is right for the United States to recognize our record of human rights, broadly defined, not just political rights, is also quite miserable, especially in terms of economic rights. Not to mention racial issues, issues of all kinds of domination, patterns of domination. Our record is really outrageous by standards of European societies, Scandinavian countries, or some other European societies. And in fact, we should recognize that if we broaden our scope of human rights, we are deficient in many, many ways, even in reference to Asian societies, economic rights in particular. So there should be a new negotiation where we are all in this together, right? Broadly defined human rights discourse, we're just deficient in many other areas. Your miserable record of political rights sometimes can be compared very well with our miserable record of economic rights. So let's begin the negotiation, begin the bargaining. The whole notion that we can use human rights as a kind of, in a sense, a very arrogant way of approaching these societies as if they are not as civilized as we are, is, I think, extremely misleading. The strategy for a number of years of linking human rights with economic sanction with also is always disastrous. The linkage issue is to obscure the whole discussion of human rights. So people are not sure whether the United States is really interested in human rights or interested in balancing the budget or interested in international trade. They're not linked theoretically, but they're linked practically in terms of political expediency. And it won't work because, as we know, that industrial East Asian societies now, even with socialist Asian societies, are economically extremely powerful. And they may, our control of the of the world economy is now no more than 18%, and just comparable to industrial East Asia. And the situation is changing very, very rapidly. Now, the European common market has a larger volume of trade with Pacific countries than with the United States. And we have a much larger trade with the Pacific countries than with European societies. And at the same time, because of the economic power, if we link simply human rights to economic interest, we're not going to be persuasive at all. So in this sense, then, we need to begin a different kind of conversation. I want to underscore my position that we are justified in pursuing the whole discussion of human rights in terms of the minimum requirements of civilized governments in dealing with their own citizens. So we could condemn the Tiananmen incident, totally justified, even though we're not part of the Chinese political scene. We could condemn the Chinese government for many of its very brutal suppressions of dissidents. I think we're justified in doing that. But we need to open ourselves. We are also vulnerable. They can condemn us in terms of our inability to deal with our homeless. They can condemn us for our inability to deal with some obvious racial conflict. We cannot say we are so much sealed by all these human rights discourse. We can condemn them whenever they say anything about us, we become extremely angry. And so you have no right to say anything about us. So I think that's a very difficult problem. The Social Summit, which was organized in 1995 in Copenhagen, with emphasis on poverty, unemployment, and social disintegration, is an indication of a new kind of awareness, even in the UN discourse. Underlying this new discourse is the idea of human dignity, which is closely interconnected with human rights. Indeed, the participants of the seminar on the ethical and spiritual dimensions of social development organized by the United Nations viewed that human rights, which have been more to do with ethics, law, and politics, and whose respect can be verified and measured, constitute the preferred means of putting into practice the concept of human dignity. So now we want the human rights discourse to be linked to an idea of human dignity, even though we know in practical terms the kind of instruments we use through UN and other kind of international organizations help us through human rights to put the human dignity question in the agenda. This, however, does not call into question the perception. This is the position paper I presented. The perception of the person as a central relationships. In other words, there's no need for us to insist upon individualism as the only philosophical justification for human rights. The perception that a person as a central relationship, of course, you have to emphasize both the center and the relationships. As a center for the learning for the sake of the self, the person's dignity is not reducible to the person's sociality because there is a center there. And yet, with emphasis on the relationships, that center has to be understood in relationship to an ever-expanding network. So you don't have to argue that a person is an isolated individual as a basis for human rights. The idea of society as a community of trust is not at all in conflict with the human rights discourse. Human rights discourse is not based upon the conception of the idea of society as an adversarial system. Now, even the belief that each person is duty-bound to respect his or her family, society, and nation is not at all in conflict with either political rights or socio-economic rights. Actually, there is virtue consensus in all the discussions that since respect for rights and exercise of responsibility are evident of human dignity, individual rights and responsibility for self-cultivation, regulation of family, order in society, governance of state, peace throughout the world, and harmony with nature are inseparable. In other words, for the person to command our respect because the dignity of the person, we not only accept and respect the rights of the person, but also demand the responsibility of the person to the rights of other people involved in the same network. Now, it is in this context, the so-called Asian values, which emerged in the regional meeting of Bangkok in 1993, provide us with an opportunity to develop a truly ecumenical agenda for allowing the human rights discourse to become a continuously evolving and hopefully even edifying conversation. I'm critically aware of the fact that even though in the Bangkok Declaration, all the nations, all the Asian nations, including India, signed the Bangkok Declaration, which is a challenge to the kind of universalizability of human rights as political rights as understood by the United States and a few European countries. But the NGOs, meaning non-governmental organizations in Asia, in Bangkok, signed a declaration criticizing the position paper that's signed by all the Asian nations. In other words, within the discourse on Asian values in Asia, there's a split, at least a rupture, between the governmental positions and the position of the non-governmental organizations. In fact, the non-governmental organizations seems to subscribe to a great deal of the rhetoric of the American and the European ideas about human rights, especially focusing on political rights, because many of these non-governmental organizations suffer from lack of political rights. Quite understandable. So the danger of using Asian values as a cover for authoritarian praxis is something we need to be noted. So I don't necessarily listen to an official from the Asian countries to say, well, we have our special conditions, so don't impose your human rights discourse on us. Because if you listen to the voices of the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, Asian intellectuals, they may have a different position on this. But the authentic possibility of dialogue, communication, and mutual benefit must be explored. The perceived Asian preference, which is also Confucian, for duty, harmony, consensus, network, ritual, human relatedness, trust, and sympathy, in my view, need not be a threat to rights consciousness, especially if we understand rights consciousness not as a dogma. Many of our officials and congressmen, I just met a person second in command from Peking, from our embassy in Beijing. I don't have to name his name, but he said the major problem for the embassy is to host meetings for the American congressmen, American general public to come and lecture to all these Chinese officials about human rights. Every time a congressman who has no knowledge about Asia arrived in Beijing, the first thing he wanted a meeting and lecture the Chinese officials about the miserable human rights record. The critique of acquisitive individualism, vicious competitiveness, even pernicious relativism, and excessive litigiousness help us to understand that some of the values that we cherish the most do not necessarily cohere into an integrated guide for action. We know the conflict between liberty and equality. We know the question of the lack of concern for community. We know the question of social disintegration because of all kinds of social political factors. We know also the questions of violence and question of crime. In our section at 11 o'clock, we talk about the crime rate. And it's incredible. I don't know the statistic count. If you, in a society like Japan, the crime rate nationally, we're talking about 100 million people. Nationally, the crime rate is about 1/10 of the city of New York. Now, one of the reasons for this kind of low crime rate, you can say, is because of lack of liberty. One liberty that none of the Asian countries, citizens in none of the Asian countries have, is to bear arms. Everybody, arm is totally outlawed. No one has a shotgun if it is not for official duties. So this kind of gun control of all these East Asian societies may have been at least one of the factors for the low crime rate. Now, we have to ask ourselves, should we continue to maintain our freedom of holding a shotgun for self-protection as a sacred right, of course, in the Constitution, or we are willing to negotiate for maybe a higher level of safety in the society? So Asian values in this sense are as richly textured ideas of human flourishing can serve as a source of inspiration for representing human rights as a common language of humanity. Now, under the leadership of Professor Ted DeBerry, you may have read some of his articles of Columbia, we've engaged ourselves, I'm included, in a series of meetings, generally characterized as human rights in the Confucian perspective, or a Confucian perspective on human rights. And last year, jointly, under the sponsorship of the East-West Center in Honolulu and the Confucius Foundation of Beijing, we organized the first International Human Rights Conference. And these are the issues that we explore. The Confucian conception of the self, person, and individual in relation to state and society. Confucian conceptions of self-cultivation, self-control, and mutual respect as the key to governance. Rights, protected in Confucian ritual and Chinese law. The relationship between rights, responsibilities, and duties. Human rights in the perspective of Confucian and Western conceptions of social and political justice. Religious and intellectual freedom in a comparative Chinese-Western perspective. Constitutionalism, the rule of law and comparative governance in the West and in China. A reappraisal in historical perspective of the May 4th, meaning May 4th movement, 1919, critique of Confucianism. With this very, very broad agenda, it's not confrontational. It's intended to open up a discussion between Chinese intellectuals and American intellectuals on the human rights issue. And of course, we hope that a kind of common understanding will emerge so that instruments for promoting human rights, while universally connected, are firmly grounded in indigenous cultural traditions as well. And of course, we also hope that through cultural dialogue, face-to-face communication, and even mutually beneficial exchange, the conceptualization of human rights will overcome its narrowly defined in terms of instrumental rationality, in its kind of intellectual naivety, and even self-imposed parochialism. Unfortunately, the term human rights becomes so sensitive in any kind of international dialogue, especially between East and West, between China and the West. The Chinese delegation, the last minute, refused to come. So none of them showed up, with the exception of one. But we're not totally discouraged. We tried again, and now in this coming May, we're going to have our second meeting. Again, the Confucian perspective on human rights. At least up to now, with our fingers crossed, 7 scholars from China are going to come and dialogue with us on some of these issues. So in conclusion, I think the time is ripe for people, especially many of you, I know many of you are actively involved in human rights discussions, and some of you become interns for the various kinds of human rights groups, both to recognize that in recent years, the instrument, especially not the United Nations instrument, the American instrument, in promoting human rights all over the world, has been narrowly focused on political rights. That's how they can work. And that project should be continued with a clear understanding that any civilized government ought to respect the basic political rights of its citizens. And it is our responsibility anywhere that is being violated. So I think we have all the justification to pursue the line of thinking. However, now for the first time, that has to be put in a much broader context. The broader context is human rights in a comparative cultural perspective. We have to broaden the human rights discourse from political rights to economic rights, social rights, cultural rights, and try to understand how human dignity, which is the basis of human rights, can be enriched, can be even empowered by various kinds of traditional insights, including the Confucian, but also Islamic, certainly the Judaic, the Christian, and none of these major traditions ever developed human rights consciousness. It's a modern consciousness. And yet each of these traditions has a great deal to share concerning human dignity. If human dignity is the basis of human rights, of course, links to the question of responsibility, part of the society, then we can have a much more fruitful discourse on human rights.